Amen.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Obviously, I'm going to talk about racial justice and anxiety, actually. I support the cause of racial justice, yet I could still not wrap my head around the recent protests in the middle of a pandemic. After weeks of scrupulously working to flatten the curve, we were doing just the exact opposite. For better and for worse, I'm kind of obsessed over this paradox, reading every possible explanation for why people are just going out into the streets with seemingly abandon. Some articles argue that systemic racism is as dangerous to our health and well-being as COVID-19 is. Others say the protests are an outgrowth of COVID-19, which has exacerbated the socioeconomic divide between whites and African Americans and many other minorities as well. I agree with both notions, yet I am perplexed by the about-face from shelter at home to marching in the streets, sometimes with abandon. Then on Sunday night, I came across an article from the Washington Post explaining that the protests are results of emotions boiling over. We are all full of emotions, especially anxiety. The curve may be flattened for now, but we are anxious for the future. The anxiety fills us with other emotions, including anger, frustration, and exhaustion. Our emotions are the kindling, the article says, and the tragic killing of George Floyd on video is the match that set us afire. And once the fire was set, there is no stopping people. The article notes that some people made calculated risks, saying that now is the time to strongly advocate for change. There were stories of baby boomers who protested in the 60s and scrupulously followed the rules of quarantine as people in their 60s. But they felt compelled to go out and made a judgment call. But other protesters didn't think at all. When asked, they commented they just acted purely on emotion. Through the prism of this article, I see the protests as a truly human event. As we sure know, life is full of shades of gray. There are a lot of moving pieces and competing needs and priorities. And in this crisis, or these crises really, our emotional regulation is working on overload. The best way to affect change in a functional society is when the people articulate their needs and problems, and the leaders heed those needs, and the collective comes together to work together for creative solutions to the problems. This message, this lesson comes out clearly when we contrast two episodes in today's Torah portion: the request for the Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, and the request, really the cry out, for meat and flesh to eat. Though it comes later in the text, let us begin with the cry for flesh. The Israelites wept and said, "If only we had meat to eat." We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, they says, b'chinam, without paying for it. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and oh, the garlic. Now our gullets are shriveled. There's nothing at all, nothing but this manna to look at. The Lord gets angry, and Moses is distressed. Moses says to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not enjoyed your favor, that you have laid the burden of all this people upon me?" A wind comes from the Lord, and he stands up and sweeps quail from the sea and strews them all over the camp. Many days' journey on each side, the Torah says. But while the meat was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, the Torah says, the anger of the Lord blazed forth against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a severe plague, naming the place Kivrot HaTa'ava, because that's the place where people with craving were buried. Let me emphasize that we should not infer that our modern day plagues are punishments from God for particular actions. The purpose of the Torah is to teach us about human nature. The episode is a call for change that went sour through the fault of all parties involved. At this point in the narrative, the Israelites have been eating manna for over a year. As the Torah describes it, it's sweet and nourishing. Yet the lack of variety bothers them. They have manna fatigue, and they want their barbecue. But when they make their request, it is all wrong. They belittle all that God has done to free them from slavery and to take Israel as God's own, as a nation. They just remember the food that they had in Egypt supposedly tasted better, or at least was varied. They forget that it came with hard labor, as we read about every Passover. They blame God and Moses for their strong emotions. And as can be expected, Moses and God react with anger and defensiveness. Where is the Israelites' gratitude and appreciation for all we did? Moses even blames God for choosing him as leader. In this episode, nothing is fixed. Nothing becomes better. The Israelites are worse off. Some of them are dead, buried in Kivrot HaTa'ava. And the relationship between the people and God and Moses is frayed. This is dysfunctional change at its worst. Let us contrast it to the Pesach Sheni, just a couple chapters earlier. It is the first anniversary of the Passover. God wants all of Israel to offer the lamb in celebration. However, there are some who are ritually impure and by rule cannot offer the sacrifice at its appointed time. They ask, we are unclean, yet we want to offer the Passover. Moses, what shall we do? And Moses says, this is one of my favorite things, great question. Let me go ask the big person upstairs. And then the Lord speaks to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people saying, when any of you or your posterity are defiled by a corpse or even on a long journey, you shall offer the Passover offering in the second month on the 14th day at twilight, and they shall eat it with matzot and maror. In this case, there was also a need and a problem that needed a solution. People were unable to observe the Passover because of purity rules. They respectfully came to Moses and Aaron, presented the facts pretty dispassionately, and neither God nor Moses gets angry, and a solution is found. They'll get a second chance a month later. This past Sunday, the UJA and the JCRC held a virtual gathering titled Space for Healing and Listening. The gathering featured African-American leaders, including Attorney General Letitia James, Congressman Gregory Meeks, and Reverend Charles Galbraith from Brooklyn, and others. All of the speakers shared personal stories of persecution and racism. Many clearly remember witnessing parents being publicly humiliated just for the color of their skin. As Jews, these stories should strike a familiar chord. There is a hopeful tenor in their speeches. All of them speak about constructively moving on and using this tragedy for the country to see a community that is in distress, that has specific needs and problems that can be solved with creativity and determination. The African American leaders on this gathering formally asked their Jewish brothers and sisters to join them in being a force for change. All Americans truly deserve equal access to all that American life has to offer: healthcare, education, economic opportunity. They note that if we truly respect all people, then justice and equality is easy to achieve. Reverend Galbraith's words touched me the most, perhaps because he's a fellow clergy person. If you look at the prophets, he says, you will notice that they alternate almost dizzily from preaching rebuke and doom to calling for love, reconciliation, and redemption. We see exactly that in today's Haftarah. The priest's clothes are filthy from corruption and idolatry. Yet Zechariah puts on new clothes and rekindles the menorah. We need to acknowledge our flaws, but without love and hope, and the hope for reconciliation, there is no motivation to improve. The protests did what they intended to do. They woke us up to systemic problems that need creative and determined change. I, for one, intend to take our African American brothers and sisters now by the metaphorical hand to help them advocate and implement systemic change for the betterment of all. And I invite you to join me. Shabbat Shalom.